Good evening. Thank you for coming. You're very welcome to have come to this conference. Thanks to the Chesterton Institute, we are having, I hope, this interesting conference on the subject of eugenics. I would like to introduce Gloria Garafulich-Grabois, who is the managing editor of the Chesterton Review, and she's also the associate director of the Chesterton Institute.
Good afternoon. On behalf of the Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture, Seton University, Life Network Malta Foundation, and the Chesterton Group in Malta, I would like to welcome you to our third Chesterton Conference in Malta. We are grateful for your interest in our work and for being here today. Father Boyd, Dr. Quinn, and I are delighted to return to your beautiful country to talk about Chesterton among Chestertonians. This is our third conference in Malta. We must remember our friend and great Chestertonian, the late John Micallef, also known as Romer. John and his Chestertonian friends were instrumental in the organization of the first Chesterton Conference in May 2012. The conference was chaired by his close friend, Professor Peter Vassallo, formerly the chair of the English department at the University of Malta. The conference was dedicated to John, who sadly was not able to see the result of his efforts. A second conference was held in May 2014. Today's event, as well as our past conferences, have been made possible by the wonderful work of Dr. Klaus Vella-Bardon and Mr. Adrian Porter. Please join me in thanking them for their dedication. The theme of this year's conference is Chesterton and Eugenics, the challenge of our time. In 1883, Francis Galton, an English Victorian statistician, sociologist, among other things, was inspired by Charles Darwin's book, The Origin of the Species. And it was a work in this area that would form the basis of the philosophy that in 1883 he named eugenics. The word eugenics is derived from the Greek word eugenes, meaning well-born, good genes. But its actual definition is not as simple as these two words that sometimes are loosely used. Its actual definition is the science of improving a human population, controlled breeding, in order to increase the occurrence of desirable heritable characteristics. In other words, it refers to the study of methods of improving the quality of the human race by selective breeding. At the beginning of the 20th century, eugenics received good press. In the New York Times, for example, it received constant and positive coverage. Bernard Shaw wrote that nothing but a eugenic religion could save civilization from the fate that has overtaken all previous civilizations. What we must fight is for the freedom to breed the race without being hampered by the mass of irrelevant conditions implied in the institution of marriage. What we need is freedom for the people who have never seen each other before and never intend to see one another again to produce children under certain definite public conditions without loss of honor. At the time, one of the few writers who wrote against eugenics was G.K. Chesterton. In his prophetic book, Eugenics and Other Evils, published in 1922, the year he converted to Catholicism, he writes, "For the moral basis, it is obvious that man's ethical responsibility varies with his knowledge of consequences. In Chesterton's view, eugenics desensitizes people to the value of human life." Our sponsors and our speakers summon us here today to recall, defend, and highlight Chesterton's prophecies concerning the value and importance of every human life, and to insist that the existence of God and the family are incompatible with the practice of eugenics. Every human being, no matter how challenged by physical or non-physical difficulty, has a unique dignity and is worthy of respect. At the end of the conference, and as you leave, you will receive a little card with Chesterton's poem, To the Babe Unborn, of which I will now read 2 stanzas of the poem. I think that if they gave me leave, within that want to stand, I would be good for all the day I spent in fairyland. They should not hear a word from me of selfishness or scorn. If only I could find the way, if only I were born. Today's conference and the importance of this topic in today's world has been covered by Vatican Radio, as well as all the major Catholic news media in the United States. I will now introduce you to today's speakers. Father Ian Boyd is a Canadian priest and internationally recognized Chesterton scholar. He is the author of the novels of G.K. Chesterton. For many years, he was professor of English at St. Thomas More College at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada. Currently, he is a member of the Department of English at Seton University in South Orange, New Jersey. Father Boyd lectures on the subject of sacramental themes in modern literature. Among Christian authors whose work he discusses are T.S. Eliot, Graham Greene, C.S. Lewis, Flannery O'Connor, Pierce Paul Reed, Muriel Spark, and Evelyn Waugh. In 19th century literature, he's interested in the work of such authors as Charles Dickens, Anthony Trollope, and Nathaniel Hawthorne. Father Boyd is the founder and editor of the Chesterton Review and the president of the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture based at Seton Hall University. Father Boyd. Dr. Dermot Quinn is professor of history at Seton Hall University, a member of the board of advisors of the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture, and a member of the editorial board of the Chesterton Review. He was educated at Trinity College in Dublin and New College in Oxford, where he was awarded a doctorate in 1986. He has written extensively on Chestertonian themes and has authored 3 books: The Irish in New Jersey, 4 Centuries of American Life, Patronage and Piety, The Politics of English Roman Catholicism, and Understanding Northern Ireland. As well as he has written many articles and reviews in the field of British and Irish history. Dr. Quinn? Dr. Klaus Vella-Bardon. He's a dentist by profession. He has been active in the media for some 20-odd years. In 2014, he was involved in the setting up of Life Network Foundation Malta, an NGO that became registered in 2015. The foundation is active in promoting and defending pro-life issues. Life Network Malta is a co-organizer of this conference, and we're most grateful for their wonderful work, which bear fruits in today's conference. After the 3 presentations, there will be a Q&A session, and we will have closing remarks by Dr. Miriam Sciberras. Dr. Sciberras is a dentist by profession, married, and has 9 children. She's very active in catechesis, in the parish schools and marriage preparation courses. She's also a frequent guest on radio and TV defending pro-life issues. Since the founding of Life Network Malta as a registered NGO, last year she has served as chairman. You will meet her a little later. Thank you.
Okay. Once again, on behalf of Life Network, I would like to thank you for attending this conference on Chesterton and Eugenics. Gloria stole my thunder, so I won't refer to the tribute she has already given. She gave us a good introduction. We are, as I said, we are greatly indebted to Father Ian Boyd, Dr. Dermot Quinn, and Gloria for coming all the way to Malta from Seton College, USA, and to give us a conference on this subject, which I feel is so relevant to the times we live in. And some of you may wonder, but you shouldn't be wondering so much now because Gloria already told you, what is eugenics? What relevance does it have in today's world? Well, eugenics is the science of improving a population by controlled breeding, to increase the occurrence of desirable genetic characteristics, like you breed horses or rabbits or whatever. As it was proposed by Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin, and this was greeted with great enthusiasm by the social elite of the 20th century. They said, well, this is what we need. Sadly, these ideas, this philosophy, led to the ideology of Nazism in Germany, which believed in the creation of a master race. The horrors of forced sterilization, euthanasia, and the mass murder of the concentration camps shook public opinion to the core after the war, and eugenics was discredited, at least in the public eye, for a while. I'm quite sure our distinguished speakers will illustrate how Chesterton stood almost alone and fought this concept, and he was a very jolly type. He was a very jolly man. He liked his food, he liked his cigars, and he liked writing. When on eugenics, he lost it. He said, it ought to be destroyed as a sting, no more to be bargained about than poisoning. Adding, and nothing remains to us but rebellion. So we expect you to be rebels by the end of this conference. Today, the relevance of entertaining evil and wrong-headed ideas is as pertinent as ever, no matter how good one's intentions may be. The road to heaven out of hell is littered done with good intentions. In a landmark essay written in the Tablet in 1978 on Catholics and Nazis, Donald Nichols, a historian from Yorkshire, tried to fathom how the Germans were seduced, because basically we are talking of a civilized country in a way, by the ideology of Nazism. And his German friends told him that they lacked the spirit of discretion, or discretio spiritum. To his astonishment, he discovered that the root of the word discretion is derived from the Greek word skor. I don't know Greek, but it means shit. So the person who lacks discretion in the deepest sense of the word is one who does not recognize shit for what it is. Under the guise of tolerance, we are conned into believing that we should give any idea a hearing, no matter how evil it may be. We foolishly imagine that no harm can come from just entertaining evil ideas, like let's debate abortion or whatever. We are losing the ability to discern evil and its inevitable consequences. The West is being subjected to a sustained assault on life, the family, and religion. The abortion, fertility, and pharmaceutical industries, even the media, news, fashion, and the entertainment industries remain silent or actively promote this corrosive ideology. And one of its consequences is leading to the catastrophic and irreversible decline in the birth rate. So maybe the good thing about negative ideas is that you die out. Only an ostrich could be unaware of the sustained, relentless, and insidious campaign to undermine the Christian values that underpinned our country. And Malta is being portrayed as backward, anachronistic, out of step, because it does not legalize abortion, euthanasia, genetic manipulation, and as Yul Brynner would say in The King and I, etc., etc., etc. Well, Life Network Malta is an organization that believes in the non-negotiable right to life. In a world that treats the right to life so callously, be it through terrorism, human rights abuses, or the corrosive medical technologies that treat life of the weak and vulnerable as of no consequence, this conference should be a wake-up call. Thank you. I ask Father Boy to the podium.
Well, good evening. The topic, I must say, is a grim one, and in a way, it's out of keeping with Chesterton's wonderful good humor. He was able to do something which very few people are able to do, and that is he combined seriousness with humor. Do you remember one of his early books? He explained that the opposite of being funny is not being serious. He said the opposite of being funny is being not funny. Well, this is what I have to say, and I think the subject we're talking about this evening is certainly serious, but I'm afraid there's nothing very funny about it. Chesterton and Eugenics. I think that we Chestertonians have a right to be a little proud about the role Chesterton played in challenging the eugenics movement. This is a story about an astonishing and heartening success in the culture wars of the early 20th century. In an article published in our journal, the Chesterton Review, Russell Sparks, an English intellectual, wrote and described Chesterton as the enemy of eugenics. Mr. Sparks gives a full account of what happened in Chesterton's day. And what he describes, that is what Mr. Sparks describes in his writings, is an example, is a story of how Chesterton challenged a fashionable cause in which, I have to add, the political right and the political left of the day were working in tandem. His opponents belonged to every Labour party, the Labour Party, the Conservatives, I'm sorry to say, and the party which called itself liberal. Chesterton opposed them all on the subject of eugenics. It all began then at the beginning of the 20th century when the Conservative Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, established, this is the English way of doing things, he established a royal commission to look into the matter of what was vaguely called the care and control of the feeble-minded, a term never, of course, precisely defined. In 1908, we had in the UK a Liberal government, and this committee, set up by the Conservative Prime Minister, finally had a report sent to this new Liberal government. And the report recommended the compulsory detention of those described as, quotation marks, mentally handicapped, and the compulsory sterilization of those described as the unfit. I'm sorry to say that Winston Churchill, the Home Secretary at the time, wrote to Prime Minister Asquith in support of this wicked report. Legislation along the lines recommended in the report, legislation along these lines, Churchill pointed out, had already been implemented in America, in Indiana, and Churchill thought that the American legislation provided the model for what should be done in Britain. The feeble-minded represented, in Churchill's words, quote, a terrible danger to the race. To the race. The British political elites were almost unanimous in support of the same measures. In 1912, there was an international eugenics conference held in London, attended by some 750 delegates, including, again, Balfour and Churchill. The conference was also an expression of the general progressive, what was called the progressive opinion of the day. Among the socialists, the Fabian socialists, in Fabian Tract number 131, for example, eugenics was described as the solution to what was called the urgent problems, quote, of national deterioration. And here's a good example of the racist feeling underlying so much of the eugenics movement. The Fabian Tract went on to say, to speak about the danger that the country was facing from the Irish and the Jews. Such was the situation when Chesterton launched his lonely campaign against the eugenics movement. Clearly, the forces he opposed were formidable and well-entrenched. Consider, for example, a parliamentary bill which enjoyed cross-party support. The Mental Deficiency Act had, as I say, been first introduced in the UK Parliament by Balfour's Conservative government without any widespread opposition. Yet, here's the encouraging thing, largely because of Chesterton's efforts, by the time the bill was passed in July of 1913, few of its most odious features were left in the final draft. It's worth noting that the amendments to the bill that were made as a result of Chesterton's criticism, those amendments meant that in the final version, the bill did not so much as mention sterilization. And there was no longer any suggestion that the so-called unfit should be prevented from having children. Really, the only eugenics recommendation left in the bill was the provision that illegitimate children, presumably, as Chesterton would have pointed out, the illegitimate children the bill had in mind were the children of the poor, since they were the only ones in any danger of being taken from their parents and entrusted to the tender care, what they called government care. Now, it was legislation by the rich, which was an assault on the poor. Chesterton's achievement then was really impressive. There's no doubt that the reason why the legislation in its final form was relatively harmless was because of his challenge to it. What might have happened if his campaign had failed or never taken place did happen in America and also in many other countries in the Western world, including my own country, Canada, France, and Sweden. The speed with which widespread eugenic legislation was adapted is illustrated by the American experience. In 1907, a compulsory sterilization law was introduced in Indiana, already referred to, and it was passed by that state's legislature. In 1917, 16 other American states had implemented similar legislation. By 1929, 24 states had eugenics laws. And by 1939, 30,000 sterilizations had taken place, 10,000 of them in California alone. Now, there's another aspect of Chesterton's challenge to eugenics, which is, I think, also important to remember. One should note, not only in the context of the time in which it occurred, but also how Chesterton's challenge to eugenics was an expression of his social and moral philosophy. Remember, Chesterton had always been an enemy of statist measures of any kind. I don't think it's going too far. It's like Dorothy Day. I think he could be called a philosophical anarchist. He viewed even the most seeming innocent of legislative reforms with great suspicion. His opposition to Lloyd George's compulsory health insurance act is a good example of his general position. Although this law, Lloyd George's law, gave large numbers of poor employees free medical treatment, Chesterton noted that it did so at the expense of their individual liberty. It was an example of what his friend Belloc warned about in his great 1912 book, The Servile State. And in that book, Belloc explained what the title of his book meant. The servile state, Belloc wrote, quote, was an arrangement of society in which so considerable a number of the families and individuals are constrained by positive law to labor for the advantage of other families and individuals as to stamp the whole community with the mark of such labor, servile labor. In other words, it represented a return to slavery. Chesterton endorsed his friend's view entirely. But even more importantly, Chesterton saw eugenics as an affront to the religious dignity of the human person. For him, the poor, who were the objects of eugenics legislation, were sacred because they were sacramental images of Christ. What was done to them was also done to him. This belief was eloquently expressed in a poem he wrote entitled "The Neglected Child." This verse was prefaced by an ironic note in which Chesterton explained that his poem was, quote, dedicated in a glow of Christian charity to a philanthropic society. The poem read as follows, I think you'll catch its religious meaning at once. The teachers in the temple, they did not lift their eyes for the blazing star of Bethlehem or the wise men grown wise. They heeded jot or tittle. They heeded not a jot the rending voice in Ramah and the children that were not, of how the panic of the poor choked all the fields with flight, of how the red sword of the rich ran ravening through the night. They made their notes, which naked and monstrous and obscene, a tyrant bathed in all the blood of men that might have been. But they did chide Our Lady and tax her for this thing, that she had lost him for a time and sought him sorrowing. A number of features of this verse are significant. First of all, no reader can fail to note that it is suffused with strong feeling. It is angry satire. And one must always remember that Chesterton was profoundly angry about the injustices of eugenics. He saw it as a cowardly attack inflicted on those who were unable to defend themselves. As Charles Williams memorably explained, you might say that Chesterton, in the end, had only two friends. They were God and the people. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And these two friends of Chesterton were without weapons and without a voice. Yeah. So Chesterton said, I shall be your weapon. I shall be your voice. The voice of those who could not speak for themselves and those children of the poor who could not defend themselves. Another feature of the poem is even more significant. It expresses Chesterton's strong religious feeling. Always he was a religious thinker, a sacramental thinker. He therefore believed that the Christian mysteries were extended throughout time. In his view, the one gospel story is reenacted in every human life. From this point of view, he interpreted the attack on the poor, represented by the eugenics movement, as a reenactment of what King Herod did when he massacred the holy innocents in the hope of killing the divine Messiah. In the final stanza, did you notice? The theme of Mary's grief at the 3-day loss of Christ, of the Christ child, when he was in the temple, is also part of the same pattern. In St. Luke's Gospel, where this incident is recorded, in St. Luke's Gospel, when the grieving Mary, the incident foreshadows what was going to happen at the time of Christ's death, when the grieving Mary will once again seek the absent Christ for the 3 days prior to the resurrection. There is a hint here that the struggle against eugenics will also end in the triumph of another resurrection. In his great epic poem, The Ballad of the White Horse, published in its final form in 1911, at the very height of the eugenics crisis, Chesterton affirmed his belief that the apparent helplessness of the Christian cause could never weaken the Christian's unfailing hope in the victory that eventually comes to those who rely on divine help. In this poem, the words the fugitive and apparently defeated King Alfred speaks at the time of the Danish invasion of England, the words Chesterton puts in the mouth of King Arthur, I think, can be read as an expression of Chesterton's hope that the struggle against eugenics, although never likely to be permanently won, at least in this world, would, however, never be permanently lost. Here are the words of the poem. Just brief words from the poem. Chesterton writes, "And though you hunt the Christian man like a hare on the hillside, the hare, the rabbit, the hare has still more heart to run than you have heart to ride." The same Chesterton hope explains how a morally indignant Chesterton could still pity the human perpetrators of the eugenic evil. In his autobiography, Chesterton recalls a saying he once heard from one of his Anglo-Catholic friends, namely, that the only possible basis for optimism is a belief in the devil, since those who believe in the existence of the evil one are able to understand that the human perpetrators of evil should be pitied because they can be regarded as hopeless and helpless victims. Chesterton was also capable of regarding eugenics as absurd. Part of the eugenic theory involved the idea that the human race could be improved by state-sponsored selective marriages, a program, he believed, that would be more suitable for the breeding of animals than for the producing of children. Many of those who promoted this idea had been influenced by the writings of Nietzsche concerning the coming of a Superman. Nietzsche's ideas in this regard were introduced to English readers in the years immediately prior to War I by Chesterton's friend A.R. Orridge. It was in the October 29th, 1908, of Orridge's own socialist weekly journal, The New Age, that Orridge actually published a piece by Chesterton in which Chesterton mocked the idea of a Superman. Nietzsche had called his Superman hero Zarathustra, also sprach Zarathustra. And then Chesterton wrote a little alphabetical poem, A, B, C, with a verse for each one. And you came to the letter S, and Chesterton wrote, S is the Superman, harmless and fat. A theosophist, he's T, the letter T, is a theosophist losing his hat. Z, Zarathustra, who couldn't take stout. He made war on the weak, and they banged him about. In Bernard Shaw's play Man and Superman, the same eugenic theory of scientifically arranged marriages is presented. And in Chesterton's 1909 book about Shaw, George Bernard Shaw, Chesterton laughingly comments on Shaw's theory. The outline of Shaw's play, Man and Superman, Chesterton writes, is, I suppose, by this time sufficiently well known. It has two main philosophical motives. The first is that what he calls the life force, the old infidels called it nature, which seems a neater word, and nobody knows the meaning of either of them. Yes, nature desires above all things to make suitable marriages, to produce a purer and prouder race, or eventually to produce a Superman. The second idea is that in this effecting of racial marriages, the woman is a more conscious agent than the man. But Chesterton's interest in the religious dimension of life caused him to praise certain lines in Shaw's play in which Shaw's characters express a religious dignity which contradicts the eugenic theory they are supposed to be illustrating. Concerning the power of these few lines, Chesterton writes, of the power of the lines, that seems to me, Chesterton says, to be actually great. I do not like either of the characters an atom more than formerly, but I can see shining and shaking through them at that instant the splendor of the God that made them and of the image of the God who wrote their story. In this passage, Chesterton laughs at the absurdity of Shaw's attempt to dramatize the eugenic theory sympathetically, but as always, Chesterton's humor is deeply, deeply, deeply serious. There's a final point about Chesterton's response to the challenge of eugenics that should, I think, also be noted. Although his writings on the subject must be understood in the context of the age in which they first appeared, the writings possess a prophetic character which illuminates matters which would become clear only many years after Chesterton wrote them, and in fact became totally clear only in our own time. It might be said that in our day, eugenic ideas have once again begun to assume a new air of respectability. And this is happening in spite, as Klaus pointed out, in spite of the memory of what happened of the last time they were implemented with every attendant horror in Nazi Germany. Chesterton had always identified Germany as the home of irreligious scientific materialism. In the preface to his 1922 book, Eugenics and Other Evils, Chesterton writes that he had hoped that World War I had permanently discredited the eugenic project. He explains that most of what he had to say in this book was written before the First World War. Quote, though most of the conclusions, especially toward the end, are conceived with reference to recent events. That being the case, he said, the actual bulk of the preliminary notes about the science, the so-called science of eugenics, were written before the war. It was a time, Chesterton writes, when the theme was the topic of the hour, when eugenic babies, not visibly very distinguishable from other babies, sprawled all over the illustrated papers, when the evolutionary fancy of Nietzsche was the new cry among the intellectuals, and when Bernard Shaw and others were considering the idea that to breed a man like a cart horse was the true way to attain that higher civilization of intellectual magnanimity and sympathetic insight, which may be found in cart horses. It may therefore appear, Chesterton says, that I took the opinion too controversially, and it seems to me that I sometimes took it too seriously. But the criticism of eugenics soon expanded of itself into a more general criticism of a modern craze for scientific officialism and strict social organization. Nevertheless, Chesterton concludes, that ideas which he had thought discredited by the defeat of Germany were once again being promoted throughout the Western world. I might say in conclusion that the defeat of Germany in World War II has also failed to discredit the eugenic ideas which inspired the even more horrifying eugenic project of Adolf Hitler. Dr. Joseph Mengele and Heinrich Himmler are dead, thank God, but many of their practices are still with us. The life of the unborn child is routinely terminated, as they say, in hospitals of the so-called civilized West. More than that, the separation of science from morality has led to experiments in genetic manipulation that recall the worst features of the search for life without moral restraints. C.S. Lewis, a warm admirer of Chesterton, outlined some of these things that would happen when the separation is complete in his treatise, The Abolition of Man, and in the third volume of his space trilogy entitled That Hideous Strength. Chesterton never ceased to issue the same warnings. As Father Brown, as Chesterton's Father Brown said in one of the Father Brown stories, this is not only a question of damn nonsense, but also of nonsense that can damn. Nevertheless, it must always be remembered that Chesterton's challenge to the eugenics movement in his own country was a resounding success. His triumph then gives all opponents of eugenics hope. His writings continue to provide us with the ideas and arguments that can help us to win similar victories. Thank you.
I now call Professor Dermot Quinn to the podium, please.
Thank you, Klaus, and thank you, everybody, for coming along this evening. I'm in the slightly invidious position of being the last speaker. So Gloria stole Klaus's thunder, and Klaus stole Father Boyd's thunder, and Father Boyd has stolen my thunder. So I have very little thunder left, and I apologize. There may be some facts that I will give you this evening that you've heard already, and you'll simply have to accept that I hadn't heard what Gloria was going to say, or Father Boyd, or Klaus. So I do apologize, but it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening. When I come to conferences, I always discover new things. I discovered, for example, this evening, the etymology of the word discretion, and I will never forget that. In fact, I don't think I'll ever use the word again. So thank you, Klaus, for informing me about that. I would also, I'd like to thank you all for coming, and I know some of you have come from a very long way, and at the end of the evening, I think we might even acknowledge that some of you have come from a very long way, indeed longer, farther distance than even Father Boyd, Gloria, and myself. When I come to Malta, I always think of three literary figures, English literary figures. I think of Lord Byron, and Lord Byron, when he saw Valletta, complained about its cursed streets of stairs, and I know exactly what he meant by complaining about its cursed streets of stairs. I think of Chesterton, of course, who took one look at those cursed streets of stairs and simply spent all his time in the Osborne Hotel and didn't leave. In fairness, Chesterton wasn't a well man when he came to Malta, but even Chesterton, as a fit man, would have found it difficult to deal with the cursed streets of stairs of Valletta. And then I think finally of Sir Walter Scott. And Walter Scott, as you know, described Valletta as a city built by gentlemen for gentlemen. And when I think of the gentlemen of Valletta, I think in particular of Klaus and Adrian Porter, two gentlemen from Valletta. That sounds like a play by Shakespeare. Two gentlemen from Valletta who have been extremely hospitable to their visitors and have been extremely influential in putting together this conference and do profoundly important work in Valletta and Malta and indeed far beyond it. Well, in 1922, G.K.Chesterton published a collection of essays called Eugenics and Other Evils that many people, Chesterton included, thought should never have been written. Certainly, it was not well received in some circles, with one reviewer writing that its only interest was pathological, and another that Chesterton was ridiculous and reactionary, a foe of progress who had fallen into the ditch or gutter. Bernard Shaw thought that the title was nonsense, and that Chesterton could as easily have written obstetrics or optics or mathematics and other evils. So these were not encouraging reviews. And even Chesterton thought that the book should not have been published, if only because it should not have been needed in the first place. Most of it had been written in 1913 and abandoned in 1918 after Germany's defeat in the First World War. Yet here he was, years later, bringing it before the public in the most extravagant terms. In its opening lines, he denounced eugenics as a tyranny, an evil, a thing no more to be bargained with than poison. The wisest thing in the world is to cry out before you are hurt, he said. It is no good to cry out after you are mortally hurt. To its proponents, eugenics represented life. To Chesterton, it represented death. So, who was right? In the next few minutes, I propose to answer that question. But first, some history, some of which you have heard already. In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. And 6 years later, Darwin's cousin, Francis Galton, published an article in Macmillan's magazine which teased out the implications of The Origin of Species. The power of man, I quote, the power of man over animal life in producing whatever variations of form we please is enormously great. It would seem as though the physical structure of future generations was almost as plastic as clay under the breeder's will. It is my desire to show more pointedly than has been attempted before that mental qualities are equally under control. Well, if any moment marked the beginning of eugenics, it is this. A flood of works followed from Galton's facile pen, all arguing that better breeding was a matter of science. Hereditary Genius in 1869. Inquiries into Human Faculty in 1883, the book in which, as Gloria has told us, the word eugenics appeared for the first time. Record of Family Faculties in 1884, and Natural Inheritance in 1889. Galton died in 1911, but not before inspiring a generation of disciples, some of them serious scientists, others not. Distinguishing between positive eugenics, breeding better humans, and negative eugenics, the elimination of the weak, infirm, and inadequate, many biologists embrace the former as a serious possibility. Charles Davenport published Eugenics, the Science of Human Improvement by Better Breeding in 1905, and Arthur Estabrook published Mongrel Virginians the following decade. The eugenics revolution had begun. Nor would it soon end. In 1906, the breakfast cereal magnate J.H. Kellogg created the Race Betterment Foundation in Battle Creek, Michigan, to promote the cleansing of the breeding stock. In 1907, Indiana, as Father Boyd pointed out, Indiana mandated that its degenerate prison population be forcibly vasectomized. Between 1911 and 1936, 24 states in the United States passed sterilization laws. In 1907, the Eugenics Education Society was founded in London, later renamed the Galton Institute, whose chief publication, the Eugenics Review, lasted until 1968. In 1912, the first International Eugenics Conference took place in London, as Father Boyd pointed out, attended by 750 delegates. A chair of genetics was established at Cambridge. Research fellowships and scholarships were established at the University of London. The German Society for Race Hygiene was founded in 1905, followed by the American Eugenics Society and the French Eugenics Society, both in 1912. By the 1920s, eugenics societies flourished in the Soviet Union, Mexico, Scandinavia, Brazil, Japan, Ireland, and elsewhere. Not all of this activity was sinister, and much of it was self-consciously enlightened. In the modern eugenic movement, there is much that is opposed to Catholic principles, wrote Father Thomas Gerard in his 1917 book, The Church and Eugenics. But at the same time, there is much that is highly conducive to the end for which God's church exists. Gerard pointed out that the prohibition in the United States of marriage between first cousins enforced in civil law a long-standing ecclesiastical impediment. Likewise, the Jesuit theologian T.J. Slater, writing in the Irish Theological Quarterly in 1911, saw no difficulty in reconciling eugenics with Catholic teaching. Quote, "The object of eugenics, then, the physical and mental improvement of the race of mankind, is part of the object of charity, the chief and noblest of the Christian virtues. If the spiritual good of mankind be added to the list of objects, the end of eugenics could be identical with that for which the Catholic Church exists and works. Eugenics, in this sense, is already a dogma of faith and a creed of action for every true Christian." Slater argued that if it could be shown to be for the common good, there would be no moral difficulty in extending the canonical prohibition against consanguineous marriage to include those who had been guilty of wife murder or abduction. It had been done before, it could be done again. But soon enough, a more sinister side of eugenics revealed itself. In 1916, a New York lawyer and Yale graduate, Madison Grant, published a bestseller, The Passing of the Great Race, whose language was lurid. Quote, "A rigid system of selection through the elimination of those who are weak or unfit, in other words, social failures, would enable us to get rid of the undesirables who crowd our jails, hospitals, and insane asylums. The individual himself can be nourished, educated, and protected by the community during his lifetime, but the state, through sterilization, must see to it that his line stops with him, or else future generations will be cursed with an ever-increasing load of misguided sentimentalism. This practical, merciful, and inevitable solution can be applied to an ever-widening circle of social discards, beginning always with the criminal, the diseased, and the insane, and gradually extending to types which may be called weaklings rather than defectives, and perhaps ultimately to worthless race types. End of quotation. Hitler later wrote to Grant, telling him that the book was his Bible. High-minded, science-worshipping, contemptuous of opponents, Grant foresaw a future in which social problems could be bred out of the racial stock, leaving the world to be enjoyed by superior races. And he was not alone. What we need, and Gloria quoted this already, what we need, wrote Bernard Shaw, is freedom for people who have never seen each other before and never intend to see one another again, to produce children under certain definite public conditions without loss of honor. Let the state give every defective full knowledge of how to avoid children and supply them free with contraceptives, said Birth Control News in 1922. Better still, offer them substantial monetary reward to consent to sterilization. Unless, I continue to quote, unless the influx of low-caste foreigners, especially from Eastern Europe, is checked, wrote a correspondent to the same journal, they will fill up the gaps and mongrelize our English and Scottish stock. Like rats, these low-caste foreigners have large families, are industrious workers, and have strong tribal instincts. But compared with our people, they are cunning, bloodthirsty, and cowardly. How can we expect to be anything but a C3 nation? Asked Lady Frances Leland Barrett, a prominent eugenicist and a minor poet, a minor Christian poet, I should add. How can we expect to be anything but a C3 nation when lunatics, epileptics, dipsomaniacs, feeble-minded and tubercular persons are permitted to reproduce themselves? The inefficient, I continue to quote, the inefficient, feeble-minded, subnormal class in the community are at present multiplying at a most enormous rate, complained Charles Darcy, who was the Church of Ireland Bishop of Belfast. What is really wanted above all is to prevent the marriage and multiplication of the unfit, and almost anything would be worth doing to attain that end. If I had my way, wrote D.H. Lawrence, I would build a lethal chamber as big as the Crystal Palace, with a military band playing softly and a cinematograph working brightly. Then I'd go out into the back streets and main streets and bring them in, all the sick, the halt, the maimed. I would lead them gently, and they would smile a weary thanks, and the band would softly bubble out the Alleluia chorus. Well, however exaggerated or psychotic, these class hatreds presented themselves in the early 20th century as reasonable. Only a reactionary could object to scientific solutions to social problems. Only a reactionary could wish for misery to multiply itself. As it turned out, one such reactionary was Chesterton. Eugenics and Other Evils was composed, as Father has told us, was composed largely in opposition to the Feeble-Minded Control Bill of 1912 and the Mental Deficiency Act of 1913. Two pieces of legislation typical of what Chesterton called the servile state, in which economic divisions between social classes were ratified by the force of positive law. Although the Feeble-Minded Control Bill never became law, the Mental Deficiency Act passed with near unanimous parliamentary approval and remained on the statute books until 1959. making provision for treatment in colonies of 4 classes of persons deemed unfit for society: idiots, imbeciles, feeble-minded persons, and moral imbeciles. Father Gerard, whom I quoted earlier, thought it contained excellent provisions for dealing with an urgent problem. And he lamented the opposition to it from Father Vincent MacNab, who denounced it in a Catholic Truth Society pamphlet, and Chesterton, who condemned it as a piece of yawning idiocy, quite simply a bill for incarcerating as madmen those whom no doctor would consent to call mad. Well, to Gerard and to others, these were excessive anxieties. To Chesterton, they were signs that the eugenic state had already arrived. His first objection to that state, indeed to any state, as Father Boyd has pointed out, his first objection to that state was its coerciveness. Eugenicists were simply itching to exercise power over other human beings. Every tramp, I quote Chesterton, every tramp who is sulky, every labourer who is shy, every rustic who is eccentric, can quite easily be brought under such conditions as were designed for homicidal maniacs. That is the situation, and that is the point. Yet, how much did these eugenicists really know of the lives of others? The poor are not a race, Chesterton insisted. They are not a breed. They are not barbarians from the abyss. They are, I quote Chesterton, they are in cold fact what Dickens describes, a dustbin of individual accidents, of damaged dignity, and often of damaged gentility. There are, as Chesterton said, there are beautiful healthy children, beautiful dying children, ugly dying children, ugly uproarious children in Petticoat Lane or Park Lane. There are people of every physical and mental type, of every sort of health and breeding in a single back street. They have nothing in common but the wrong we do to them. They are as big as you are, whoever you are, said the New York writer Joseph Mitchell, defending the ordinary people of that extraordinary city of New York. And Chesterton, another great defender of ordinary life, agreed. You have been advocating the sterilization of moral degenerates, Father MacNab said to a group of eugenicists. Well, I am a moral expert, and I certify you as moral degenerates. Good afternoon. Yet surely heredity itself was not in dispute. Facts were facts, after all. The science was clear. Actually, as Chesterton pointed out, the facts were not clear, for the simple reason that eugenics is not a science. It only looks like one. Its claim that of all factors making a human being, genes are paramount is demonstrably unscientific, lacking the barest conditions of proof and excluding a priori all other variables and contributory considerations. As science, it is simply a tautology, an enormous circular argument. To Chesterton, the first 3 facts of heredity are that it exists, that it is subtle, and that its myriad elements cannot be reduced to one. Beyond that, the facts of eugenics are fictions. I quote Chesterton. You know there is wine in the soup. You do not know how many wines there are in the soup because you do not know how many wines there are in the world. And you will never know because all chemists, all cooks, and all common sense people will tell you that the soup is of such a sort that it can never be chemically analyzed. That is a perfectly fair parallel to the hereditary element in the human soul. The soup cannot be analyzed. It cannot be chemically reduced. And this refusal by Chesterton to be intimidated by pseudoscience was intellectually courageous. Were there not Cambridge chairs and London institutes and international conferences to proclaim the opposite? Journals and statistics and government reports? The whole apparatus of scholarly respectability? Chesterton and MacNab called their bluff. They knew that eugenicist language, to the extent that it described anything at all, described merely the state of mind of those who used it. To speak of low-caste foreigners, mongrelized races, good pedigree, was to make political, not scientific claims. These were, if you like, object lessons in how not to be objective. Indeed, British eugenicists of the 1930s, who were almost always men of the left, tailored their science to suit their politics. As the politics changed, so did the science. J.B.S. Haldane, for example, became less of a eugenicist as he became more of a Marxist. Professor Julian Huxley dropped eugenics partly because a friend had told him that in propagating it, he was acting like a neo-Nazi. In other words, eugenics was never about science, even to scientists. It was politics first and last. It could be discarded when a new fashion came along, which is a rather ironic fate for an ideology that stressed the survival of the fittest. So, coercive then, and scientifically flimsy, eugenics was also, and Klaus has made this point, eugenics was also unapologetically a form of class hatred. At bottom, many eugenicists simply despised the urban poor and wanted to avoid personal and social contamination by them. Chesterton's task was to give voice to the voiceless, to speak on behalf of the patronized, and to tell elites to mind their own business. Women of the working class should not have more than 2 children, said Margaret Sanger, founder of Planned Parenthood. We should apply a stern and rigid policy of sterilization and segregation to that grade of population whose progeny is tainted or whose inheritance is such that objectionable traits may be transmitted to offspring. That's Margaret Sanger. To William Beveridge, the sainted father of Britain's welfare state, the unemployable, quote, must become the acknowledged dependents of the state, but with complete and permanent loss of all citizen rights, including not only the franchise, but civil freedom and fatherhood. To Bertrand Russell, quote, government opposition to birth control gives a biological advantage to stupidity. If the state paid for childbearing, it might and ought to require a medical certificate that the parents were such as to give a reasonable result of a healthy child. To H.G. Wells, sterilization offered the solution to, quote, a multitude of contemptible and silly creatures, fear-driven and helpless and useless, feeble, ugly, inefficient, born of unrestrained lusts, and multiplying through sheer incontinence and stupidity. Well, these were the same working classes, it should be added, who had fought and defeated Germany in the Great War. The same working classes who had confronted the scientifically organized state and had defeated it. If eugenics was thus a new religion, and scientists its high priests, it was also peculiarly a doctrine that appealed both to the left and the right, a point that Father Boyd made. Figures of the left were attracted to it. The likes of Julian Huxley, Leonard Darwin, Karl Pearson, Mary Stopes, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, John Maynard Keynes, Harold Lasky, and J.B.S. Haldane. But so too were figures on the right, with most to gain from keeping the working class in its place. To a degree that may surprise those expecting a tract devoted to science, Eugenics and Other Evils is stuffed with arguments to do with property. Widespread popular ownership, what Chesterton called distributism, was the answer to the eugenicist nightmare. The book's celebration of ordinary life is a celebration, ultimately, of human freedom and dignity. The dignity that comes from owning property, the dignity of productive self-reliance, the dignity of raising a family, the dignity of an independent life. Eugenics threatened these things, and property made them possible. Without it, without property, there was no protection against eugenic or other experiments, no protection against the coercive state, no protection against joyless bureaucrats, no protection against what Chesterton called terrorism by 10th-rate professors. No protection at all. And I quote Chesterton, "If the man who took away beer as an unlawful pleasure had paused for a moment to define the lawful pleasures, there might be a different situation. If the man who had denied one liberty had taken the opportunity to affirm other liberties, there might be some defense for them. But it never occurs to them to admit any liberties at all. It never so much as crosses their minds. Hence the excuse for the last oppression will always serve as well for the next oppression, and to that tyranny there can be no end." Well, let us update the story. Chesterton was aware of the distinction between positive and negative eugenics. He was fully in favor of healthy babies and happy motherhood. He did not deny heredity or congenital imbecility or other inherited disease. What he did deny was the right of the state to ascribe madness or incompetence to people undeserving of such ascription and thus ascribed to lock them up. Eugenics and Other Evils is a book, from one point of view, about limits on the power of the state. Yet it is also, more profoundly, a book about the dignity of every human life. Human persons are not objects without rights over whom the state may exercise control. They are subjects of rights to whom the state owes protection and care. The fundamental assertion of the eugenicists was that some lives are more worthy of respect than others. The denial of that claim was Chesterton's chief purpose in writing the book. It might be thought, then, that his work is done and that the book has achieved its purpose. Chesterton and MacNab were decades ahead of their time in warning of the sinister implications of eugenics, facing down even theologians prepared to give good breeding a guarded welcome in the name of church teaching. After Casti Connubii of 1930, Pius XI's encyclical, the Church's position with respect to eugenics was no longer in doubt. Denouncing those who would shamelessly deny the great sanctity of Christian wedlock by relying on, quote, the false principles of a new and utterly perverse morality, Pius, quoting Leo XIII, reminded readers that to take away from man the natural and primeval right of marriage, to circumscribe in any way the principal ends of marriage to increase and multiply, was beyond the power of any human law. Quote, all the inventions of modern science, he was referring to radio and the cinema, all the inventions of modern science had trampled upon and derided the sanctity of marriage. Books are not lacking which dare to pronounce themselves as scientific, but which in truth are merely coated with a veneer of science in order that they may the more easily insinuate their ideas. Chesterton, not yet a Catholic, had said much the same thing nearly 20 years before. Yet, and this is the point that Father Boyd has made, yet the notion that eugenics has been discredited is sadly mistaken. Not only is it not discredited, it is dangerously in the ascendant. Eugenicists are not easily embarrassed. If Joseph Mengele or Adolf Hitler cannot shame them, no one will. Their agenda must again be made public until, at last, the public repudiates it. It cannot survive exposure. It thrives on concealment. Consider first the fact that a eugenic state has now become, for better or worse, a eugenic world. Chesterton only imagined what has now become commonplace: the manipulation of genetic material for commercial gain, the commoditization of human fertility, the buying and selling of fetal body parts. As the historian Matthew Connolly has shown, the eugenicist agenda has crossed boundaries and oceans to become international. Of the Cairo Conference on Population and Development of 1994, he writes in his book Fatal Misconception, The Struggle to Control World Population, that, quote, "The essence of population control, whether it targeted migrants, the unfit, or families that seemed either too big or too small, was to make rules for other people without having to answer to them. It appealed, population control, it appealed to people with power, because with the spread of emancipatory movements, it began to appear easier and more profitable to control populations than to control territory. That is why opponents were essentially correct, and of course the most notable opponent is the Vatican. That is why opponents were essentially correct in viewing it as another chapter in the unfinished business of imperialism." Well, that sounds a lot like Chesterton 100 years ago. Consider also the fact that some lives continue to be less worthy of respect than others. The annual number of abortions has increased globally from 50 million in 1990 to 56 million in 2014. Around the world, about a quarter of all pregnancies end in abortion. In a grim distortion of language, the Guttmacher Institute promotes abortion in the United States by promoting motherhood. Patients, what they call patients, had abortions, it claims, pregnancy obviously considered an illness and not a sign of health. Patients had abortions because of, quote, their understanding of parenthood and family life, concern for other individuals, the ability to afford a child, the belief that having a baby would interfere with work, school, or the ability to care for dependents. So in other words, promoting abortion by claiming it seemed to promote family life and childhood. I mean, a grim, grim distortion of language. The Guttmacher Institute, it should be added, is named after Dr. Alan Guttmacher, who had this to say to fellow physicians in 1969, quote, "Each country will have to decide its own form of coercion and determine how it is to be employed. At present, the means available are compulsory sterilization and compulsory abortion. Perhaps someday a way of enforcing compulsory birth control will be feasible." Consider thirdly, this my point being the ascendancy of the eugenic state. Consider thirdly the crisis of fertility in the industrial West, a phenomenon first noted in the 1920s when eugenics was in fashion, and evident again in the 1960s when the contraceptive revolution helped to destroy many traditional forms of family life. As Alan Carlson has noted, total fertility for Europe in 2012 was 1.58, meaning that the average European woman will bear only 1.58 children in her lifetime, only 75% of the level needed to replace a generation. The same year, 2012, deaths outnumbered births in over 20 European nations. In Northern Europe, marriage is increasingly rare, replaced by cohabitation. In Southern Europe, young adults increasingly refuse to form childbearing unions of any sort. The family, says Australian demographer John Caldwell, is not infinitely adaptable to modern society. A social order that does not reproduce itself will be replaced by another. Secularization is, quote, the most powerful variable at the outset of fertility decline, according to the Belgian demographer Ron Lestege. The collapse of European fertility, he argues, may be traced to a long-term shift from Christian values, responsibility, sacrifice, altruism, and sanctity of long-term commitments, towards secular individualism focused on the desire of the self. Consider, finally, the current practices of genetic science and the legal structures that underpin them. In Britain, the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act of 2008 puts in place some of the most permissive laws in the world. Its main anxiety, it seems, not the protection of embryos, but their ownership. The Act allows sex selection of implanted embryos for medical reasons, experimentation on admixed human and animal embryos, destruction of unused embryos, supporting parenting rather than a father for a child conceived through fertility treatment. And some geneticists considered that legislation too restrictive and wished to see it relaxed. And some feminists complained of its indifference to what they called the wide variety of family forms that reproductive technologies potentially enable. You can work out for yourselves what they meant by that. The child developing in utero remains vulnerable to intervention allegedly conducted on its behalf. Thus, the elimination of Down syndrome often means the elimination, by means of abortion, of unborn children who have it. Even when a cure is on offer, the term itself presuming disease, profound moral questions are raised without being answered. Consider a recent news report from the United States. Professor Lee Herzenberg is a research geneticist at Stanford University. Her son, Michael, suffers from Down syndrome. Michael can read. He can use a cell phone. He is stubborn. He loves his mother, who never raised him. His room is covered with pictures of his biological and adoptive families. He lives a worthy and beautiful life. He is loved and loving. Yet Professor Herzenberg has this to say about him. If I had the choice of not pushing Michael into this life, if I at that time would know I was carrying a Down syndrome child, I would have aborted the child. I see no reason Michael has to live the life he leads. The fact that we have made it very happy for him, or that he's made it very happy for us, all of that is adapting to a situation, but I don't think it is fair or proper. Well, let us charitably refrain from judging a mother who would wish of a child who loves her, that he had never been born. Let us simply record that Professor Herzenberg's efforts to eliminate the syndrome from which her son suffers has produced problematic consequences. She has developed a blood test that 10 weeks into pregnancy can detect not only Down syndrome, but a host of other chromosomal abnormalities, as well as the sex of the child-to-be. The test, it seems, is more effective than Professor Herzenberg could have wished. She is now alarmed that it is now being used to determine the sex of unborn babies. She worries about parents choosing to abort girls. She does not approve of abortion of boys, one presumes, although this is uncertain. She wished to abort at least one of them. Her objection is to abortion for reasons of sex selection. In this intuition, she is correct, even if she seems to lack the moral language to articulate it. Yet the story does not end there. One of Professor Herzenberg's former students has made prenatal testing her life's work. Now able to detect Down syndrome at 10 weeks of fetal development, she believes that the condition could be treated early in the womb itself. Theoretically, it should be possible to treat a fetus before some brain damage occurs at all. Here is, no doubt, a perfectly well-intentioned wish to ease suffering. But at what cost? Is there a limiting principle by which some such interventions are justified and others not? And once justified, why not required? To the extent that a moral principle may be discerned here, it is that eradicable imperfection, whatever that means, should be eradicated. Why settle for less than the best? Why tolerate the intolerable? Why suffer at all? Well, let us be careful before making such arguments. Someday, those lesser forms of life might be us. And that is why we should read Eugenics and Other Evils. It was and remains one of the most prophetic books of the 20th century. For Chesterton, eugenics was not a thing to be trucked with. It must be destroyed. I know it is praised with high professions of idealism and benevolence, he wrote, with silver-tongued rhetoric about purer motherhood and a happier posterity. But that is only because evil is always flattered. Evil always wins through the strength of its splendid dupes. In thus sounding a warning, he anticipated all too clearly our contemporary world. The child, this is Chesterton, the child unborn is still hidden from the omniscient oppressor. He who lives not yet, he and he alone is left, and they seek his life to take it away. Chesterton preferred instead the supreme adventure of being born. Born, as he said, describing his childhood, not into a world of miracles, but a miraculous world. Existence itself was gift enough. Wonder and gratitude should be our response. St. Francis of Assisi comes to mind. The Francis who saw even sickness and death as his brothers and sisters. He was above all a great giver, Chesterton wrote, and he cared for the best kind of giving, which is called thanksgiving. As Chesterton writes, if another great man wrote a grammar of assent, he, Francis, may well be said to have written a grammar of acceptance, a grammar of gratitude. He understood down to its very depths the theory of thanks, and its depths are a bottomless abyss. He knew that the praise of God stands on its strongest ground when it stands on nothing. He knew that we can best measure the towering miracle of the mere fact of existence if we realize that but for some strange mercy, we should not exist at all. If we only lived for a day, Chesterton wrote, that day would be enough. So let me conclude, as we began, with a poem first read by Gloria. I think that if they gave me leave within the world to stand, I would be good enough through all the day I spent in fairyland. They would not hear a word from me of selfishness or scorn. If only I could find the door. If only I were born. In a spirit of Chestertonian thanksgiving, let us all thank Chesterton for reminding us of that truth. Thank you very much.
Splendid. As always.
Well, we have one final piece of business to attend to, and this is a very happy piece of business. I said at the beginning that many of you have come from reasonably close by to listen to our conversation this evening, and I'm very grateful that you've all come along and have contributed fascinatingly important and good questions to the conversation. But someone has come a long way to be with us this evening in what is actually a beautiful tribute to the theme of the conference. And the theme of the conference, of course, is that we should honour human life and the dignity of all human lives. So someone has come from Poland to be with us this evening, and he is a very distinguished Chestertonian from Poland, someone who is in the process of establishing a Chesterton Institute at the Jagiellonian University in Poland, a very, very ancient and splendid university. And in order to recognize his long journey to be with us this evening, and the struggles that he has had to endure to be with us this evening, Father Boyd and Dr. Vella-Bardon would like to give him a certificate. And I think that we can all not only give him a certificate, but an extremely hearty round of applause for coming all the way from Poland.
Great. Inspiration to us all. You are an inspiration to us all, and we thank you for making the journey from a country that Chesterton loved dearly, which he used to say it used to be said that God was the best friend of Poland, but some said no, and you should also add Chesterton. So thank you for coming from a country very dear to us and illustrating in your own purpose, in your own person, the theme of our conference. Many thanks.
I thank you, Father Boyd, and Miss Gloria, and Dr. Quinn. And I think if Chesterton is many love Poland people and defend the Catholic faith. Yes, it's heroes Catholic faith. Thank you.
We thank Bauer and his lovely wife for having made the journey. I would like now to invite Dr. Miriam Sciberras for her closing remarks.
ladies and gentlemen, distinguished scholars, distinguished guests. On behalf of Life Network Foundation Malta, the organizer of this event, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers from Seton Hall College, USA. Special thanks go to Father Ian Boyd and Professor Dermot Quinn. Thank you. Special thanks go to Klaus Vella-Bardon, our Vice Chairman, and Mr. Adrian Porter. Who worked so hard to make this event successful. As Klaus said in the beginning, Life Network Foundation Malta is a relatively new pro-life, pro-family NGO. But also, as Professor Quinn said in part of his speech, he said Chesterton's task was to be the voice of the voiceless. And that is our ethos. Our dedicated board members work hard at promoting and advancing a culture of life that embraces all of life, from conception to natural death. And we also promote the natural family. We have a table set up at the back for those of you interested in viewing our work, and there will be a box for donations at the door for those of you who would like to help us cover the expenses and who would like to support our work. Ladies and gentlemen, it seems that the chilling atmosphere in the aftermath of discovering the atrocities perpetrated in World War II and the words "never again" have been forgotten too quickly. Unfortunately, eugenics is making a comeback, masked under new clinical terms, such as pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, prenatal testing, nuchal line measurements, and a battery of other new modern tests, all of which mean a search and destroy mission to kill the unborn before they get a chance. We are seeing the annihilation of people with Down syndrome and other disabilities, and we must not remain silent. Unfortunately, eugenics is gaining ground. And I would like to leave you with a few famous quotes directly related to eugenics to take home with you. I wonder, which one will you make your own? And here they are. The first one, Adolf Hitler. Adolf Hitler admired Sparta, which was famous for its eugenic selection. And he said this: "The exposure of the sick, weak, deformed children ensured their destruction was more decent, in truth 1,000 times more humane than the wretched insanity of our day, which preserves the most pathological of subjects." The second quotation, Peter Singer, professor of bioethics at the Center of Human Values, Princeton University. So you see, the term bioethics, no, it's not always a good word. It doesn't always generate the good feeling that ethics used to give us. And Peter Singer said this: "Killing a disabled infant is not morally equivalent to killing a person. Very often, it is not wrong at all." The third quotation is by Professor Robert Edwards, who worked with Professor Steptoe in creating the world's first IVF baby, Louise Brown, born in 1978. And Professor Edwards said this: "It will soon be a sin for parents to give birth to a disabled child. We are entering a world where we have to consider the quality of our children." The fourth quotation is from Jana Jessen, who was in Malta in December, and she's an abortion survivor. And she said this: "The value of human life does not depend on how wanted or unwanted he or she is, nor by health, intelligence, or ability. I was unwanted, I survived an abortion, and have the gift of cerebral palsy, and my life has value." The next quotation is from Professor Jérôme Lejeune, the geneticist that Klaus mentioned earlier on, who was the discoverer of the gene for trisomy 21, Down syndrome. And he said this: "People say the price of genetic disease is high. If these individuals could be eliminated early on, the savings would be enormous. It cannot be denied that the price of the disease is high in suffering for the individual and in burden for society, not to mention what parents suffer. But we can assign a value to that price. It is precisely what a society must pay to remain fully human." And the last quotation, which I will close with, is also from Professor Lejeune. And this is a very famous quote. And he says this: "We need to be clear. The quality of a civilization can be measured by the respect it has for its weakest members. There is no other criterion." So with these quotations, I wish to thank you all very much for attending this event. I now invite you to join us for coffee, where we can continue the discussion. And if you want to make a donation, we have a box at the door. And thank you very much.
There's one very, very final piece of business to attend to, and I apologize for delaying coffee. I don't believe in delaying coffee. I think that, that coffee is one of the great bioethical advances of recent times. So everybody's as much in need of coffee as I imagine all of you are. But just one final little thing to do, and that is to thank Gloria, who has been from the Chesterton Institute end of things, the organizer of this conference, and Gloria has worked very, very hard indeed and has produced all of the materials that you're reading and so on. The last piece of business is to draw your attention to the fact that the Chesterton Review is the journal of the Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture. It has been published since 1974. There are some, I think it's a really, I have a kind of a personal interest in this, but I think it's a really fine journal, and I invite you to take out a subscription to the Chesterton Review. You can read it online or take out a subscription. The information is on the back of the back of the little brochure. And the great news about the taking out of a subscription to the Chesterton Review is that the Holy Father has said that if you do take out a subscription to the Chesterton Review, you get a plenary indulgence, and what better reason for taking out, in this year of mercy, a subscription to the Chesterton Review than a plenary indulgence. So I invite you all to have coffee and we can continue the conversation.